All right, joining us this week for Know Your Enemy, Colorado versus Utah, we got Josh Furlong from KSL Sports joining us. Josh, we got to start off with the quarterback situation. Obviously, Devin Dampier a little banged up. You have Byrd Ficklin, who Coach Whittingham has talked about potentially starting. Just how do you feel, one, about Byrd Ficklin if he joins or if he does play on Saturday, and where's Devin at with his injury?
Yeah, so let's start with Byrd, I guess. So Byrd is a true freshman quarterback. I mean, he's a guy that has shown a lot of potential in the limited time that he's gotten. He has been able to play in 2 full quarters for Utah in garbage time minutes, and so they like what they've seen. He's 9 of 9 on the season. He's contributed in total, I think, 4 touchdowns. So I think they feel confident that they've got something from him, but that's going to drastically be different if he has to go into first team reps and in that situation. So, there's a lot of confidence there. He has a similar skill set to what Devin Dampier has, and so it's not the end of the world. They feel as long as he's able to kind of stay composed and do what he needs to. But he's been a guy that doesn't seem like he gets overshadowed by the spotlight or anything that way. He seems to show up. On the Devin Dampier side, he got banged up pretty good in that BYU game last week. I mean, this was something where going into that fourth quarter, they put a pretty sturdy brace on his ankle to try to make sure that he could be okay. Walking around the facility this week, he's not wearing that big of a brace. It's a little bit more casual, but that's more in just kind of light work stuff. So my guess, and based on the conversations I've had with people, that it's probably, he's probably out this week. I know he wants to play and he would do whatever he can to try to get in there, but I think they have to look at kind of the longevity of the season and see where he's at. And, maybe at the very least try to give Byrd the nod. And if, something happens, see if Devin can go. But at this point, I would probably lean more to Byrd getting the play, but I wouldn't at all be surprised if Kyle decides to trot out Devin Dampier at all.
I'm curious if you mentioned, obviously, Dampier got beat up pretty good last week. And typically that matchup, the Holy War, that rivalry between BYU and Utah gets pretty physical. Obviously, Colorado played Utah after they were in the Holy War last year, and we know how that game went. I don't know if maybe the doldrums coming out of that game, led to the result by any means, but is there any kind of worry just about you pour so much into that rivalry game like that, the week after there might be a little lull? Is there any worry about that?
Yeah, for sure. And that's a big reason why a lot of Utah fans were frustrated that this game came in the middle of October and not at the end of the season in kind of the true rivalry week. So that's tough. It's tough to be able to have to come off an emotional game, especially one in which you felt, or at least Utah fans felt like they could win it, and kind of shot themselves in the foot, didn't allow themselves to really take hold of that game, and then have to come and prepare for Colorado. And I think, on the outside, it's really easy to look at Colorado's record and say, oh yeah, this is a team that we got. Utah's traditionally had a good streak against Colorado in the games that they've played. But in my opinion, this is dangerous, right? You're not potentially coming in with your starting quarterback. You're coming in with a mentality where you're trying to get over that loss, but it lingers over you. And now you have to do that in a way that you have to kind of play up to the opponent. So, I'm really curious to see how this goes. I think from the Utah's perspective, this game alone is really going to tell what kind of season Utah has, right? Is this the season where Utah can still get 10-2, or is this a season where it's 8-4? What kind of season is this, and how does Utah respond? So, Colorado, especially coming off of a bye and all that kind of stuff, that's a tough test for Utah, and it's not going to get any easier.
Josh, going back to the offensive side of the ball, Colorado fans are used to watching Jordan Seaton, a very good left tackle. Utah's got 2 fantastic tackles, though, in Spencer Fanu and Caleb Lomu. Just what do those 2 guys, how do they kind of elevate this offense, and how do they change how the game is maybe called and why Utah is so run heavy this year?
Yeah, this is one of those things where you have 2 guys that can legitimately give you the time that you need to be able to develop the plays. And so for all of some of the limitations that Devin Dampier may have in whatever his game is in terms of passing, he's not the tallest quarterback. they afford a lot of flexibility there because they can hold the line for much longer than you would traditionally see. And so it allows them to be able to do a lot more behind the line of scrimmage. They're able to kind of get into these different sets that can really put a lot of wrinkles into the offense that forces defenses to kind of wonder what they're doing. Is he going to run? Is he going to, utilize some other, play action pass to kind of get off of this? And that has afforded them a ton of success this year. Not to mention, they've been incredibly successful on 3rd and 4th downs this year because they've been able to have guys like that. When you have guys that can create something like 3 yards per drive, I mean, you're able to get the yards that you need to on those pivotal downs. And so, those two specifically have been a great force. You do have your interior linemen that have been a little bit more up and down this season. But when you combine all of those guys together and they work in unison and in tandem, this has been an offense that is really tough to stop. It's one that they can generate a ton of yards. They can move down the field pretty efficiently and get whatever they need. But if it breaks, it hasn't been as good as what you saw that in Texas Tech. You saw that against BYU, where if you can scheme up against it well, Utah looks like a much different team, even with those guys in place.
Josh, I read your story this morning and I thought it was really well written. And I want to ask you just straight up, does Utah have an issue with field goals? Do they have trust issues? I think it's probably the best way to put it. Obviously, they got a freshman kicker. They turned down a couple opportunities to, kick a field goal, opted to go for it on 4th down. Didn't really work out. I know some fans are a bit pissed about that. What's kind of your read on Utah's, like I said, field goal situation with their freshman kicker?
Yeah, I think it's complicated, right? I think from the very beginning of fall camp, Utah felt like it was shaky. They like his talent. He's got a big leg. He legitimately can kick field goals from 60, 65 yards. I mean, he's got a leg that can do that. The problem has been, even in practice, it's been shaky. And so, they pulled back the curtain a little bit this week just because of what it was. Kyle Whittingham's not one that likes to throw his players under the bus. He wants to make sure that it's all falling on him. That's why he talked heavily about the analytics and different things that about the game that last week. But the reality is they do have a complicated relationship here there. So you're going to see them be a little bit more hesitant to go to the field goal when they know that they can try to get for those 4th downs. So, and with Utah's success on 4th downs this year, it hasn't been a problem, right? Like, it hasn't been a situation where you had to worry. And it wasn't until this week where that really kind of bit them. There were other weeks where he missed field goals, but they weren't as pivotal or as instrumental as this week. So, it's a work in progress. I mean, I think it's a learning opportunity for him as a freshman, but at the same time, you don't really have a great answer if you can't get those field goals. So I wouldn't be surprised if Utah continues to insist on going for 4th downs until they can get that settled. But I think it's all really going to come down to how their kicker really does in practice leading up to that week.
It's interesting because Iowa State had a very similar problem with their, field goal kicker a couple weeks ago for the Colorado game, and that certainly impacted that game for sure. So something to watch.
Josh, I want to ask you about Lander Barton. He's obviously going to miss the first half of this game. Just how big of a loss is that? And how different is the defense maybe going to look when he rejoins the game in the second half?
Yeah, he's one of those players that is a true linebacker in the sense that he's instinctual. He's been in the system for so long and he's just really smart in how it goes, where there's some of those things where as a coach you can't teach, and he just understands what he needs to do. He's in the right spot. And so losing a guy like that who has been this key element of your defense, he's the guy that generally will have the green dot on. They rotate it around a little bit, but he's the guy that's the one getting in the plays from the defensive coordinator. That's going to hurt, right? And so communication is going to be a big key. It's going to, that's going to be the biggest struggle in that first half. But they've got some veteran guys there. They've got John O'Hall. They've got Levani Damouni, who's been in college for like 19 years. It feels like, he comes from Stanford. He's a smart kid. He understands the game and is really solid. But I think it's more just going to the depth that if they're having struggles or they're not getting what they need to, they don't have the same depth that they had without Lander on the field. So I think they'll be okay. It's definitely not the worst situation or the worst position group to lose a guy, but you definitely want to have him on the field to be able to make sure that defense runs.
Josh, probably last question we got for you. I was listening to Coach Whittingham this week talk about Colorado, And one quote that he had that really stood out to me, he goes, the quarterback run game is right towards the top of the list of things we need to be concerned with this week. Utah has allowed opposing quarterbacks to run for at least 60 yards in 4 straight games. How much has the opponent's quarterback run game kind of hurt Utah's defense at times, especially now with obviously Kaidon Salter, a dual threat guy, coming to town this weekend?
Yeah, I think it's not entirely the quarterback, I would say. I think it's more just Utah in general being poor in tackling. And so, even last week, for example, Utah was great at being able to get into the backfield, but they couldn't wrap up. They took the wrong angle and they allowed Bear Bachmeier to escape. That's kind of the situation that they're facing this year. When you get those type of situations where Utah is going to be aggressive, trying to get in that backfield, they also play man coverage. The second that breaks down, you've got open field. And so a lot of that is tough for Utah to kind of counteract because they're not going to go into zone coverage as much. They still play it, but it's much more man-to-man coverage. And so if something does break down, if a guy for everybody to pick up and that becomes a challenge. So that's where the success has been, but I wouldn't say it's just universally quarterbacks. It could be the running back, it could be a wide receiver. That's just the nature that they kind of play with their aggressive style and man-to-man.
So Utah wins this game if fill in the blank for us.
I think they win this game if they come out aggressive and they win the line of scrimmage. I think if they can do that, everything else will kind of fall into line. Even if you do have your freshman quarterback, that's not to say, he's suddenly just going to go beat Colorado just because, the offense is moving. I think, there's still incremental steps that they need to make. They do need to get the passing game going. But I think if they can be successful in the trench play, if they can be aggressive and really kind of stamp their gameplay into this system, then they're going to be okay. I think it's when they stop kind of being aggressive and they stop they get creative or cute, that's where things change.
Awesome, Josh. Well, if you want to let the people know where to find you online, we appreciate you joining us, man. This was great.
Yeah, you can go follow me on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, at J4KSL, and then you can read my stuff at KSL.com.
Awesome, man. Appreciate you. We'll see you
Appreciate
Saturday.
you, Josh. See you there.